Chapter 1. The garden party in the screen Rose Hill cradled a peace that clung to its trees, settled on its rooftops, and murmured like an old lullaby. Life unfolded slowly, woven into routines, mornings at the bakery, afternoons tending roses, evenings with tea and the faint chime of distant church bells. It was a place where nothing truly terrible seemed possible, at least. So the villagers liked to believe the annual summer garden party at the vicarage was Rose Hill's cherished ritual. Held each June when roses bloomed in full splendor, it drew everyone, ladies in pastel frocks, shopkeepers, schoolchildren, all mingling under striped tents on Reverend Aldridge's sweeping lawn. That year's fete sparkled with familiar charm sponge cakes dusted with powdered sugar, bunting, strung between lilac trees, and the village string quartet coaxing a waltz near the fountain. Children wove through chairs, cheeks flushed and fingers sticky, while the older set claimed shady spots, teacups in hand, near the party's edge. Slightly apart, yet not unseen, sat Miss Jane Marple, a spinster of gentle demeanor. Her sharp eyes belied her modest hat and neatly folded gloves. A small embroidery bag rested on her lap, but her needle lay still. Miss Marple was listening, and I'm telling you, Mrs. Ellsworth whispered, leaning toward Mrs. Langdon with theatrical gravity. That man renting Primrose Cottage Dracotod, very odd, walks about at night, talking to himself. Oh, yes, Mrs. Langdon replied, glancing around before lowering her voice, and always watching, not just birds or trees people. Their words hushed as the vicar passed, smiling with a plate of jammed tarts. But Miss Marple had heard enough. Primrose Cottage, she thought, her mind already turning over the quiet ripples of Rose Hill's secrets that had been empty for some time before. Mr. Drackett came a young man, quiet somewhat, intense, not very social. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden, sharp sound of a scream. It came from the far side of the garden, beyond the tents, through the arch of climbing roses that led into the older chard. Not a playful shriek, not the laughter of children, but a scream filled with fear. The music faltered. Someone gasped. A plate shattered on the paving stones. People began to murmur, heads turning toward the orchard. Then came the sound of footsteps. Rapid, stumbling on gravel. A girl emerged from the rose arch, her apron stir with dirt, her hands trembling, her eyes wide with terror. It was Millie. Tomlin, the Aldridge's young housemaid. There's a man in the garden. He's, oh God. I think he's dead. A silence fell, broken only by the buzzing aft-beats. Miss Marple stood, setting her bag aside. The villagers surged behind Malice. She led them down the path behind the vicarage, the orchard, cotta, that was wild at the edges, with long grass and overgrown roses, the kind that reached entangled if left to themselves. And in the middle of it, beneath the climbing white rose, called Madame Hardy, lay a body, a Monfacci. Down still blood had pooled beneath his neck, soaking into the earth and petals. Someone turned away. Retching Reverend Aldridge dropped to knee. Good Lord, is he? Dr. Graham, who had arrived just moments earlier, knelt beside the figure, checked his pulse, and shook his head. Grimly dead. He said simply, and not recent, this didn't just happen. A shudder ran through the crowd. Miss Marple did not move closer. Didn't need to. Instead, she looked at Millie, who stood off to the side, pale as bone, her fingers clenched tightly. Her eyes weren't only frightened at were shocked, as if she'd recognized the man, as if she'd not expected him to appear at all. The police arrived not long after, led by Inspector Colin Hawthorne, a man known more for following facts than intuitional. Get to the bottom of this, he said, surveying the scene. We'll start by identifying the body. Nobody touched anything, Miss Marple. watched him go about his duties. She admired his determination, but doubted his instincts best, even from here. She could tell this wasn't a random crime there was proposed behind this killing. She turned her gaze to the rose bushes again. Something about the placement of the body. Something about the surrounding grass, flattened in two directions. And that smelled not just Rose's metallic scent. Miss Marple gently touched the sleeve of Mrs. Langdon, who stood beside her, clutching her handbag. "Did you happen to see where Mr. Drackett was during office?" she asked quietly. Mrs. Langdon blinked. "Why, no, come to think of it, I haven't seen him all afternoon." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. In Rose Hill, everyone noticed everyone. If someone wasn't seen, it means something. She didn't say another word, but as the others speculated wildly, pointing fingers and spinning stories, Miss Marple's mind was already arranging facts like pieces on a chessboard. She had seen too much of human nature to believe in accidents. This wasn't a simple crime. This was something far more personal, and if she knew anything about gardens, and she knew quite a lot, it was that roses often grew best over secrets long buried. Chapter 2. The Man Beneath the Irises. By the next morning, the peaceful hush that usually settled over rosy like morning mist was replaced by an uneasy tension. Doors were kept slightly ajar, curtains twitched more than usual, and everywhere, from the post office quay to the grocer's counter, there was only one topic of conversation: murder. In Rose Hill, the idea was nearly unthinkable. Such things happened in cities, places with factory sand, slums, and loud, angry people, not Harenot in a village of rose gardens, tea dances, and church fetes. And yet, it had happened. A man had been found dead in the vicar's orchard, his blood staining the earth, his face unknown to nearly everyone. Miss Marple had not slept much. She never did when her mind was working. After a light breakfast, apples and marmalade, she took her basket and hat and went to call on Inspector Hawthorne, who was stationed temporarily at the old council office on Wren Street. He looked up as she entered, surprise flickering over his face. "Miss Marple, good morning. I hope I'm not intruding," she said, eyes kind but steady. "Not at all," he replied, though a touch awkwardly. "We're just beginning the murning statements and the identity of the poor man." He hesitated, then said, "Almer George Carraway. No identification on him, but Dr. Graham recognized him after some digging. Used to live in North End. Lane went away about 5 years ago. In Lane, something of a black sheep." "Interesting," said Miss Marple, as if discussing the weather, and yet no one seemed to recognize him at the Gardine party. "Well, we've confirmed with the vicar and his wife. He certainly wasn't invited. Likely came through the back hedgerow." Miss Marple nodded, placing her gloved hands on the back of the wooden chair across from him. "I wonder Inspector might I ask a question or two?" He gave a short, amused breath. "I've been warned about you by Superintendent Slack. You know?" "Oh dear," she smiled. "I do hope he went too cruel," he said. "Few solve cases before Scotland Yard gets its boots on." Miss Marple's smile widened only slightly. "I'd merely like to understand. We merely Tomlin was near the AA rose beds at all. It's not common for the help to wander during a party, especially not that far into the orchard." The inspector gave a slight nod. "That's something I've been wondering myself. We've asked her to come in." As if on cue, there was a timid knock at the door. "Come in," said the inspector. Millie Tomlin entered, head bowed, hands nervously clutching her apron. She was barely 19, with a pale face and wide, anxious eyes. She looked like hadn't slept either. "Good morning, Millie," said Miss Marple softly. Millie glanced up in surprise. "Oh, morning, miss. Please sit." Hawthorne said, "We just want to clarify a few things." She sat on the edge of the carriage, and uneasy. "You were the one who discovered the body," he continued. "Can you tell us you were near the rose bushes? Weren't you meant to be helping Servitia?" Millie twisted her hands. I was Buck, Mrs. Aldrich asked me to fetch the lemon curd from the pantry, and I took Starback Way, thought I'd be quicker through the orchard you often take. That path. She shook her head. No, sir, hardly ever, but I heard something, a sort of whisper, or a rustle. I thought maybe someone had dropped something, or one of the children had wandered off, so I looked around. She swallowed. That's when I saw him lying there, still. Miss Marple watched her closely, nonchalantly. You screamed, my dear, a dreadful sound, as if you recognized him. Millie's face went pale. I didn't know him. Not exactly, just thought I might have seen you once a long time ago. Where there was a pause, Millie looked from Miss Marple to the inspector in the village. She said, finally, before I worked for the vicar, I was just a girl. I think he came to Teacups, where my mom worked. Tall man, had a voice like gravel and eyes that didn't smile. Miss Marple nodded slowly. So his return must have surprised you. Million outed her eyes, welling slightly. It scared me, Inspector. Hawthorne leaned back. Did he ever speak to you? No, sir. And he didn't speak to you yesterday? No, sir. I didn't even know he was there. After a few more questions, Millie was dismissed as she left. Miss Marple said gently, You were brave to speak up, dear. After the door closed, Inspector Hawthorne sighed. She's hiding something. Miss Marple agreed silently. But what Millie was hiding, that was the question. Miss Marple stood. I should not take up more of your time, but if I may offer one suggestion. He looked at her expectantly. Do speak to Mr. Drackett, the gentleman staying at Primrose's cottage. The villagers seemed to think him curious. We've been trying to locate him. Hasn't been seen since yesterday morning. Miss Marple tilted her head. Off. More reason to keep looking, Inspector. Sometimes the people who go missing after a murder aren't the ones in danger. They're the ones we should be looking at. Chapter 3. The man who wasn't there by the afternoon of the second day. The heat in Roselle had turned oppressive. The sun poured down with a strange intensity, and even the birds seemed quieter than usual. Yet the silence in the village wasn't due to the weather. It was the unnatural hush that follows a shock too large to speak of directly at the Primrose cottage. Their curtains remained drawn. The little gate, usually creaky from used-stage children crossing the lane, gave it a wide berth, and neighbors lowered their voices when passing. Mr. Charles Drackett, the man who had taken the cottage 2 months earlier, was missing. He had always kept to himself. Why? Polite, but not warm. A man with large eyes and long fingers, always scribbling in a battered notebook, often seen walking near the woods at Dusno, with a dead body in the orchard, and tracked, nowhere to be found. Whispers were turning into suspicion. Miss Marple, however, did not believe in jumping to conclusions. She believed in patterns in human nature, in motives that often lay quietly beneath the surface, like a snake under a garden stone. That afternoon, she walked up the narrow lane toward Quar's Cottica herself. She wore a soft gray cardigan over her summer dress and carried a basket filled with scones, which she fully intended to use as a social disguise. The gate clicked open with effort. The roses outside were overgrown, wild but unloved. She knocked gently on the door. No answers. Knocked again, 3 times, still nothing. But just as she turned to Levette's door opened a fraction of an inch. It was Mrs. Hemings, the housekeeper, a small sore-faced woman with thinning hair and a mouth that never smiled fully. Oh, she said, as if disappointed. Miss Marple. Good afternoon, Mrs. Hemings, Miss Marple said, with cheerful civility. I thought I'd bring some scone. I know how lonely cottages can feel when one is uncertain of the world outside. Mrs. Heming, she hesitated, then opened the door a little wider. You'd better come in, though, I warn you. Mr. Drackett's not here. I'd heard Miss Marple stepped inside the front room, smelled faintly of pipe smoke, and inked a cup of tea, sat cold on the small table near the writing desk. An open book lay face down on the armchair. "I imagine you've spoken to the IM police," Miss Marple asked yesterday. "They came snooping around, seemed to think I knew where he'd gone." "And do you?" Mrs. Hemings shook her head. "He left the house early. Saturday morning, said he was going to the post office, but he never came back. Fibbed his coat." Even Miss Marble's eyes passed over the room. Books, neatly shelved papers, stacked in bundles. And on the desk, a dark blue leather notebook. Did he say anything unusual lately? Was he agitated? Mrs. Hemings snorted. Agitated. Mordracket was always in his head, thoughtful, not troubled. But yes, well, Shelland closer. A week ago, I heard him arguing with someone, not loud, but sharp in the back garden late evening. I thought maybe it was a phone call, but I never heard the phone ring. And did you hear any names mentioned? Mrs. Hemings pursed her lips. "Just one," said. "You shouldn't have come back." "George?" That stuck with me. Miss Marple's brows rose just slightly. "George Carraway, the dead man in the orchard." She glanced again at the notebook on the desk. "May I?" she asked softly. Mrs. Hemings hesitated, but nodded. Miss Marple opened the notebook carefully. Most pages were filled with short, intense notes, some observational, some poetic, but a folded sheet near Quebec caught her attention. She unfolded it. It was a letter, handwritten. "Charles, I need you to understand, this isn't revenge. It's unfinished business. You and I, what we buried, isn't staying buried. I'll be in Rose Hill on the 14th. Meet me. We'll settle this once and for all." Miss Marple folded it neatly and placed it back. "Did Mr. Drackett get many visitors?" asked. "Hardly any," said Mrs. Hemings, "except for last Thursday. A man came, tall coat, too long for the weather. They talked in the garden. It's quiet, but Siriash paused, then added, That must have been him, mustn't it? The man who did, Miss." Paul nodded slowly. "It seems likely. Thank you, Mrs. Hemings. And don't enjoy the scones. They're lemon ginger." As she walked back down the lane, Miss Marple considered what she had learned. Drackett and Carraway knew each other deeply. There was something buried between them, something that Drew Squirrel had returned to settle things, and now Dratt was gone, and Carraway was dead. But it wasn't just a fight, Miss Marple had seen the body. That wound was in rage. It was deliberate, calculated, perhaps even planned, and Miss Marple had lived too long and seen too many. Polite villages hide cruel intentions. To believe that Charles Drackett was the only person in Rose Hill with secrets. Chapter 4. Whispers in the vicarage. It rained that evening in Rose Hill. Not heavily, just enough to darken the cobblestones and make the ivy glisten on the vicarage walls. The drops tapped gently against the windows, a rhythm almost comic, but not quite, inside the vicarage drawing room. Reverend Aldridge paced slowly between two tall bookcases, hands clasped behind his back. His wife, Mrs. Judith Aldridge, sat in the armchair, clutching a folded shawl and a cup of untouched tea. Warmth had long seeped out of it. "I still can't believe it," she murmured in Archid, "on the very day of the Garden party." Heiser stopped, and now the newspapers are sniffing about. "I had a call from the Hampshire Chronicle. They want to send a reporter." "That's the world," Arthur Judith said bitterly. "Something terrible happens, and everyone comes to look, not to help thee." Fell quiet as the doorbell rang. The vicar opened it to find Miss Marple, her greatcoat damp at the shoulders, but her expression composed. Miss Marple greeted her. "What a relief. Come in, please. I won't keep you long," she said, softly stepping inside. "But I wondered if I might ask a few questions about Mr. Carraway." "Ah," Judith said with a sigh. "We're not sure what help we can, but neither of us recognized him. But he used to live in Rose Hill." Miss Our pal sighed, taking a seat. The vicar nodded slowly. "Yes, George Carraway, a difficult boy. Hugh's trouble. From the start, father ran off, mother drank, lived near North End Lane, Judith added. He left after an incident, something at the old schoolhouse. The details were never shared with the parish, but the police were involved. Then on day, he was simply gone. No one missed him, if I'm being honest. Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly, and yet he returned, not for nostalgia I think, but to confront someone. Judith hesitated. Do you believe he came back for revenge? I believe he came back for a solution, Miss Marple replied, which is often the same thing, only the method differs. Arthur frowned. Do you think this Dracket fellow had something to do with it? I think Mr. Dracket is not a man prone to spontaneous violence, she said carefully, but I also think neither of them expected to meet near your rose garden of all places. There was a pause before the vicar said, He, Mr. Carraway, he must have entered through the back hedgerow. That gate is never locked. Not locked. No, Miss Marple agreed, but not many know. Is there only people who used to live in the village or were told about it? Judith's fingers tightened on the teacup. Do you think someone invited him? Miss Marple said nothing for a moment. I think, she said slowly, that Simeon in this village had a connection to George Carraway, a hidden one. And he'd think when that connection was threatened, things turned. Stark, she stood gently. Forgive me, I must not keep you. I only had one more question. Of course, the vicar said. Do you know if Millie Tomlin has any family left in Rose Hill? Judith blinked. Millie? Why no, her mother passed 2 years ago. Father never stayed long enough to be remembered. She has no brothers. Why do you ask, Miss Marple? Gaveth, softest of smiles, because she looked at that man not as a stranger, but as someone she once feared, and it occurred to me sometimes. Girls born in small village unspoken histories. The rain picked up again as Miss Marple stepped back into the street. She walked slowly, the wind tugging at her shawl, her thoughts circling tighter. George Carraway, Charles Dracket, Millie Tomlin. There's a triangle forming, not of love, but of past, of things buried. And in Miss Marple's experience, when two men shared a secret, and one of them ended up dead, the answer was rarely simple. She reached her cottage just as the rain began to pour in earnest. Inside, she dried her hand, poured herself a cup of warm milk, and sat by the fire. She didn't pick up her knitting. She didn't reach for a book. She sat perfectly still, eyes on the flames. There was a connection. She had seen it. She just didn't know yet what it meant, but she would, because the thing about murder is that it rarely stays quiet. It rattles through a village like a storm through dry trees. Secrets fall, truth ice exposed, and Miss Marple always listened for the first cracked chapter. 5. The girl in the photograph. Next morning, the village of Rose Hill woke to a chill that didn't quitamich. The season, it wasn't the weather, it was the lingering shadow of suspicion word had spread. Quickly, Charles Dracket was still missing. George Carraway was still dead, and Millie Tomlin had started keeping her tangent. In such times, people stop smiling as easily conversations become coded eyes. It's glanced twice, and everyone begins to wonder who might be next to vanish, or worse, who might be capable of murder. Miss Marple, however, went to bed the morning exactly as she always did. She opened her windows to the cool air, fed the birds. She steeped her tea precisely 4 minutes, but she also opened a drawer in her small writing desk, the one that held old papers, clippings, and personal notes, and began to search. She had once read a line in a mystery novel long ago that said, "To find the future, look at the forgotten past." She believed in that, especially now. After half an hour she found what she was looking for, an old school photograph dated nearly 15 years earlier. She had come across it at the village fete last summer, tucked in Attridge rummage box, and kept it for no reason other than the sweet expressions in the children's faces. And now, looking closely, She saw it clearly in the second row, just left of center, a boy with hard eyes, standing with his arms stiffly by his side. George Caraway in 3 rows. Behind him, smiler, uncertain, and very young, a girl with Millie's face, though years younger. Same shape of cheek, the same downward tilt of her mouth, but it wasn't their presence in the photograph that chilled Miss Marple. It was the way George's body was turned slightly toward Millie, and the way her eyes weren't looking at the camera, but at him. Not fear, not admiration, something stranger, recognition. Miss Marple folded the photo carefully and slipped it into her handbag. This needed to be seen by someone who knew the village's history better than anyone in Inrose Hill. That person was Edna Price, the village's longest-serving librarian, and a woman who remembered more than she ought to. She found Edna in her usual chair at the Rose Hill Library, a tartan shawl around her shoulders and a mug of peppermint tea near her elbow. "Jane," she said, blinking in surprise, "you look as if you've got a ghost in your pocket." "In a way, Edna," Miss Marple replied, "I do." She handed over the photo. Edna examined it with practiced eyes. "Oh my, that's the old-school photo from when Miss Catmull washed the mistress. Yes, I recognize George Caraway." "Trouble even then," Edna muttered. "Wouldn't follow rules, kept knives in his bag, had to be pulled out of lessons twice after shoving other children." "And the girl?" Marple pointed. Edna squinted, then nodded. "That's Millicent. Tomlin's sweet girl. Her mother was the cleaner at the pub. Came from nothing really. Do you remember if anything happened between them?" George and Millie, Edna frowned. "There was an incident. They didn't talk about it, Muckbud. I remember George locked her in the broom cupboard. No one knew for hours. She was just 5. Miss Marple felt her stomach turn. "And what happened after nothing?" Edna said. "Sadly, George was given a warning." Millie never said a word of booty, but she remembered. Miss Marple whispered. "That's why she screamed." "The way she did." Edna gave her a sharp look. "You think he came back for her?" "No," Miss Marple said softly. "I think he came back for someone else." But when she saw him those years collapsed into a single scream, she left the library with a growing certainty. This murder was not random. It had been seeded years ago, but now a question gnawed at her. If George was threatening Dracot, then who was protecting Dracot? Who in this quiet village would go so far to keep a secret dead and buried? And then, as if on cue, a note arrived. Miss Marple found it, stuck in her garden gate, tucked behind the iron latch. It was folded plain paper, unreceived note, envelope in tidy, nervous handwriting. It read, "He wasn't supposed to do. Please don't ask questions. Please stop." There was no signature, no name, no trace of who had left it, but to Miss Marple, it wasn't a warning. It was a confession wrapped in fear, and she just stepped directly into the heart of it. Chapter 6. The silence before the storm. Sunday morning in Rose Hill was on most weeks marked by the slow pealing off church bells, a light breeze that teased the hollyhocks, and the low murmur off rear rising from the pews. But not today. Today, the church was half empty. Some villagers stayed home, unwilling to gather so soon after the murder. Others came and sat stiffly, eyes not on the altar, but on one another. Everyone wondered the same thing. One among us has blood on their hands. Miss Marple arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, as she always did. Her expression was serene, but her mind was storming. The anonymous note from the night before still rested on her kitchen mantel couch, uncrumpled, as deliberate, placed gently on a dinner plate. He wasn't supposed to die. That wasn't the voice of a killer. That was Simeon, with a plan that had gone wrong. She sat through the service equably, but she didn't hear the sermon. Her thoughts spun, arranging themselves. Came, in silent inquiry, why had George Caraway come back now? What connected Dracot, Millie, and Caraway? in a triangle none of them wanted to exist, and who, above all, had tried to intervene only for things to go horribly wrong after the service. The vicar stood at the church door, doing his duty, shaking hands and offering measured comfort. Miss Marple approached him with a smile. "Arthur," she said gently, "may I borrow your church keys for an hour this afternoon?" The auto vicar blinked. "Whatever, for I want to look at some oft-old confirmation rolls and baptism records," she said lightly. "It's a silly instinct, I admit, but sometimes names in old ink help connect, to present." He didn't argue. He'd learned not to. When it came to Miss Marple, he simply handed her the small brass ring of keys. By 2 o'clock, the church was empty, the nave drowsy with dust and stained glass light. Miss Marple sat alone at the vestry, discoursing through brittle record books, fingers moving gently across handwritten entries in brown ink. Then she found it. March 4th, 1911, George Caraway, born to Margaretero, unmarried. A few entries below. November 10th, 1915, Millie Tomlin, born Millicent Grace Tomlin, daughter of Elsie Tomlin. Nothing unusual except for final notation in faded ink. Added years later. See also household report. 1921, cross-reference G. Caraway. Miss Marple stared at the note cross-reference. She opened the attached register, the one kept by the vicars for special cases, children sent to special homes, domestic incidents, and social disturbances. There, in a trembling hand, March 19-1, inquiry opened into young George Caraway after repeated violent conduct toward female child Millicent Tomlin, age 5, no charges pressed. Family moved. The page was signed by Reverend Dawson, Arthur's predecessor. So it was true. George had harmed Millie once before. The village had hushed it. No one had protected her property, and now he'd come back. But why return to the scene of his own shame? Miss Marple shut the books gently and sat still, letting the silence pressing. Then a noise caught her attention, the sound of footsteps just outside the vestry. She turned, expecting perhaps the vicar, a curious parishioner, but it was Millie. She stood in the doorway, pale and hollowayed, her hair tied back in a loose ribbon, hands clenched at her sides. "You saw? You come in?" she said quietly. "I knew you'd be looking." Miss Marple stooped, calm and kind. "I was hoping we'd talk." Millie looked like she hadn't slept in days. He followed me from the post office. I saw him near the bakery. I tried to pretend I didn't know who he was, but he smiled at me." Miss Marple said. "Nothing, just let the words come. I told Mr. Drackett I clean his cottage twice a week. I thought maybe he'd tell the police or talk to the vicar, but he told me to stay quiet." He knew George. Millie nodded yes. They'd been in the Salmon Children's Home for a time before George got expelled. Mr. Drackett said George was dangerous, that he'd hurt someone badly back then, but he never said who. Miss Marple exhaled gently, and then George turned up in your George. Millie's eyes filled. It wasn't supposed to happened that way. I think Mardraco tried to pay him off or scare him away, but it went wrong. Miss Marple Mavet closer. "Millie, did you write me that note?" Millie looked down. "Yes, I belly a vous," Miss Marple said, "but the police won't, not unless the full truth is known, and right now someone's protecting someone else. That sort of silence always leads to more hurt." Millie looked up slowly. "Do y'all think I killed him?" Miss Marple shook her head gently. "No, dear, but I think you were close enough to see who did." There was silence in the church outside. A breeze I picked up rustling the tall grass in the graveyard, fluttering the old yew trees inside. Millie whispered the name, just one, and it changed in everything. Chapter 7. The name in the wind. Miss Marple did not react when Millie whispered the name. She didn't gasp, she didn't blink her hands, didn't tremble, but her eyes, sharp blue, ancient in their knowledge, looked Strathra. The silence that followed Millie stood frozen, as though seeing the name had unsealed something deep and buried, and now it would spill whether she wanted it to or not. You're certain? Miss Marple asked softly. Millie nodded. I didn't mean to, but I saw them right after the scream. Miss Marple led her gently to a pew, guiding her like a parent would a child in shock. She didn't rush her, just waited as the rain outside began once again tapping lightly against the stained glass windows like a patient clock. Tell me exactly what you saw, Millie. No guesswork, just truth. Millie took a long breath. It was about 10 minutes after I found the body. I ran back toward Vigorden, and everyone else was still screaming or calling for help. But I was behind the hedge. I had taken the narrow path that cuts behind the orchard earth tool shed. Miss Marple knew it well. Few people ever walked that path. Look back once, Millie said, and saw someone near the rose bushes, not touching the body, standing over it, looking down. Not panicked, just still and thin. They bent and picked something up. Who? Miss Marple asked. Millie's voice broke. Judith Aldrich. It's the vicar's wife, the perfect hostess. It's the woman who had screamed when the body was found, who had napped like she'd never seen the man before. Miss Marple placed a hand gently in Millie's. You've done the right thing, but she's the vicar's wife. Millie whispered, no one will believe me. Miss Marple didn't argue. She knew the weight of respectability in English villages. A clergyman's wife could do no wrong, at least until someone looked hard enough. But now she had a name. A new corner of the puzzle had turned. Miss Marple didn't waste time, shelved Millie with instructions to say nothing more to anyone until she was sussed again officially. By late afternoon, she was walking through the vicarage gate. Judith Aldrich opened the door herself. Oh, Miss Marple, she said a little stiffly. Is everything all right? I wonder if ye might come in for a moment, said Miss Marple politely. Just a brief word, you understand. Judith hesitated, but stepped aside. Arthur is in his study, shall I call him? No, said Miss Marple calmly, just do. She was led into the drawing room where sunlight filtered through glass curtains, the same room where Judith had sat with her untouched tea the day of death. Murder. Miss Marple sat down slowly, setting her handbag. Visitor her. I won't waste your time, she began. I know, Judith. I know that you knew George Carraway. I know that you saw him that day. And I know you were the last person to stand over his body before anyone else arrived. Judith didn't answer immediately. Her face didn't change, but her hands folded tightly on her lap gripped each other until the knuckles went. But Miss Marple continued gently. He came back, didn't he? Not for revenge, not even for blackmail. He came back for you. A long silence. Then Judith spoke very softly. He said he wanted to tell Arthur. Miss Marple said nothing. Judith's eyes, distant now, stared at the rug. It was 20 years ago, before Arthur and I married. I was just out of school, lonely, restless. And George, he was charming back then. Dangerous, yes, but charming for a while. And then Judith's voice hardened. He changed, became cruel, possessive. One night, she faltered. He hurt me badly. I told no one. The next day, he left. He thought I'd never see him again, but he came back. Her voice trembled now. He said, if I didn't admit what happened, if I didn't kill Arthur myself, he would. He said he had letters, photos, things from when we were young. He'd kept them all. Miss Marple waited. Judith wiped at her eyes. I didn't kill him, she said. I swear it. I went to the garden after the scream. I saw him lying there. I froze. I thought perhaps someone had done it. Fawn, you picked something up? Miss Marple sagely. Judith nodded yes. An envelope with my name on it. I burned it that night. She looked up, now her voice steadier. I know it was wrong, but I didn't kill him. I didn't even touch him. Miss Marple sat back, thinking Judith had motive, opportunity, and secrets. But Miss Marple believed her, because Judith, despite her sins, hadn't lied about the pain and murder. Miss Marple had Alice now rarely came from pain alone. It came from control, from people refused to lose it, which meant the real killer was still out there, and they had known. Exactly what George Caraway threatened to reveal, Chapter 8. What the fire didn't burn the fire in the vicarage? Hearth had been unusually strong that night. Mrs. Judith Aldrich had confessed to burning. Envelope. She found the one George Caraway had left with her name on it. A final threat, a piece of her past she'd hoped was long gone. But Miss Marple knew something important people rarely burn, only what the intent to. Sometimes they panic, sometimes they miss things, and sometimes miss the fire. Refuses to obey. By Monday morning, Miss Marple made her way to the Rose Hill Constabulary, where Inspector Hawthorne was poring over witness statements that seemed to go nowhere. Inspector, she said, pleasantly but firmly, I think we need to examine the ashes from the Aldrich fireplace. He looked up the vicarage. Judith Aldrich burned a letter, one she claims George Caraway left behind, but if we're lucky, some of the envelope may still be intact. Hawthorne frowned. You think it was a confession? No, she said quietly. I think it was a message to someone else, not a threat. Within the hour they were at the vicarage. Judith stood aside wordlessly as two constables removed the cold ash from the grate. A few minutes later, a constable approached. Ma'am, there's something. They laid the fragments on Thevakar's desk, crumbling bits of charred paper, a half-melted paperclip, and a torn sliver of photograph. Miss Marple examined it carefully. It showed only part of a fascia man's chin and mouth, grainy and gray, and a small portion of another face behind it, young female. It wasn't enough to identify young definitively, but something about the woman's cheekbone and the ribbon in her hair. Millie Marple straightened. George had not only kept letters, he'd kept photos, evidence. He'd been threatening Judith, yes, but perhaps she wasn't the only one he tried to blackmail outside the vicarage. Miss Marple paused beneath the hedgerow and turned east, not toward home, but toward Primrose's cottage. Charles Drackett's disappearance had gone from curious to suspicious. She had a growing suspicion that he hadn't disappeared at all. He was being hidden. She reached the cottage and knocked sharply on the door. There was no answer. Then she knocked again, longer, louder, from behind the ivy curtain that trailed along the left side of the house. She caught the faintest flicker of movement in the attic window. A shadow Samine was watching. Miss Marple turned and left no way from the house, but around it to the back garden, where the hedges grew thickened. The compost bin stood half covered by tarp. She knocked softly on the side window, waited. The curtain shifted, then the window creaked open. It was Mrs. Hemming's housekeeper. Miss Marple, she hissed. You shouldn't be here, but I am, she said calmly, and I need to see him. Mrs. Hemmings hesitated. Torrance. It's not well, not since that day, which is why he must speak. If Hidden killed George Caraway, he must help us find out who did. After a long pause, Hemming stepped aside. Miss Marple was led through Thibach kitchen, past a darkened hallway and up a narrow flight of stairs. At the top was a door locked. Mrs. Hemmings unlocked it with Asmo brass key. Inside, Charles Drackett sat in a chair by the window, pale and unshaven eyes sunken like he hadn't slept in days. He looked up when Miss Marple entered. I thought they'd arrested Somione by now, Miss Marple said, because the truth remains just out of reach. But you can change that. He said nothing. Miss Marple sat across from him, quiet but unwavering. I know George blackmailed you. We know he kept a photograph of Millie, perhaps more than one. You knew what he had, and you knew if the police found it, they might misunderstand Drackett's eyes filled with something almost like pain. I didn't kill him. Then, who did? He hesitated. I met him that morning behind bakery. I told him to leave, gave him money. He laughed in my face. What did he want from you? Silence, Drackett said, and permission. Miss Marple tilted her head permission for what to reconnect with Simeon. He said bitterly he wouldn't say who, but I knew Millie. He wanted to talk to her again, said he deserved the right. Miss Marple's voice dropped to a whisper. And you said no. I said if he went near her, I'd report him for what he did years ago. Did anyone else hear this conversation? Draka didn't answer. Miss Marple leaned forward. Mr. Draka, I believe someone followed George that Simeon, who heard what he planned. Someone who loved Millie enough to do anything to stop him. She paused. Mrs. Hemings has no children, does? Shekels blinked. No, he said, but his voice trailed off. Miss Marple stood. Her voice was soft, but cold as stone. She protected Millie for years. Didn't she, from afar, like a second mother, quiet, invisible? But when she realized George had come back, that he'd hurt her once and might again, she followed him into the orchard. She turned to the door. She didn't mean to kill him, but shedded. Chapter 9. The Guardian. In the shadows there, inside Primrose's cottage, felt heavy now, not from dust or disuse, but from the weight of unspoken truths. Miss Marple stood silently in the narrow Waddock hallway, the door to Charles Drackett's room slowly swinging shut. Bend her footsteps on the old wooden stairs were slow and deliberate. He knew Mrs. Hemings would be waiting sure enough as she reached the ground floor. The housekeeper stood by the back door, arms folded, her apron as neat as ever, the perfect image of a loyal servant. Only now Miss Marple knew better. You've always watched over her, haven't you? Miss Marple said gently. Mrs. Hemings didn't reply. Her jaw was tight, her lips pressed in a line that had held back years of silence. I've known your type before, Miss Marple continued. Women who love her quietly, who never had children of their own, but when a child enters their life, wounded, afraid, they become mothers. Fierce ones, protective ones. Mrs. Hemings turned slowly. I didn't mean for him to die. No, Miss Marple said. I believe that. There was a long pause outside. A robin chirpadoons, then fell silent. I followed him. Mrs. Hemings said at last. Her voice was quiet like a whisper beneath the wind. When Millie came to me in tears after she saw him outside the bakery, I knew it was him. She didn't remember everything, but Kana, I did. I never forgot that little face, bruised, afraid when he left town all those years ago. I prayed he'd never come back. She looked down at her hands, but when he did, I knew it would happen again, not just the Reeds. He was circling her slowly, waiting like a fox at the edge of the house. You followed him to the vicarage garden? Yes, I saw him slip through the back gate. He thought no one noticed, but I did. He was looking for her rye, maybe trying to leave something behind, and then confronted him. Her voice broke slightly. I told him to leave. I begged. He laughed, said Millie belonged to him in a way I'd never understand, that what happened back then was just childish roughness. And so Marple's eyes darkened. He told him if he came near her again, I'd drag him to the police myself. He goadingly grabbed my wrist. I pushed him. It was instinct, and he fell. Mrs. Hemings nodded. He tripped backwards, right into the rose bush. There was a metal stake in the ground for pruning. I didn't see it, but I heard the sound, the way he stopped moving. She trailed off. You didn't mean to kill him, Miss Marple said softly. No, Mrs. Hemings whispered. I wanted to protect her. That's all I've ever done. Then I saw the envelope, his last little weapon. I couldn't leave it. It took it, and I ran. Miss Marple stepped forward. You need to tell the inspectorate. Won't be easy, but they'll understand it was an accident. But your silent secrets, what will hang over Millie's head? Mrs. Hemings looked up sharply. Millie doesn't know it was me. She must never know. Miss Marple's face softened. No one will tell her, but Vi truth needs to be recorded so it doesn't come back again in 10 years or 20 secrets. Cothis, they don't rot quietly. they leaked, there was silence for a moment. Then Marshminks nodded once, a long, slow nod, the kind a person gives, not when they agree but when they accept. There is no other road, I'll tell him, she said. Miss Marple stepped out into the garden, where the roses still held the morning dew. As she closed the gate behind her, she didn't feel triumph. She never did. Just this, yes, but never joy, because no one in these stories, there were only those who survived, and those who would live with shadows. Chapter 10. The Confession Room. The interrogation room at the Rose Hill Constabulary was rarely used. Tia had been painted recently, but no paint could completely erase the smell of old cigarettes, damp paper, and fear. At precisely 10 o'clock, Mrs. Edna Hemmings sat on the metal chair across from Inspector Colin Hawthorne. Her posture was straight, hands folded neatly on the table, just as if she were sitting at tea. But her face was that of a woman who had already sentenced herself. Miss Marple sat quietly in the corner at the inspector's invitation, not to interfere, not to direct, but tautness. Inspector Hawthorne, holding a notepad in one hand, looked up from the first few lines of his notes. Mrs. Hemmings, he said, you've requested to make a formal statement in the presence of a civilian witness, Miss Jane Marple. Are you prepared to do so voluntarily? Mrs. Hemmings nodded. I am. He clicked his pen. Then begin when you're ready, and she did, without tears, without denial, without drama. I followed George Carraway into the orchard behind the vicarage. He slipped in through the back gate during the garden party. I knew who was the moment I saw him near the bakery that morning. Knew it in my bones. 20 years ago, he hurt a child. I cared for it. He never paid for it. No one believed her. No one acted. He left the village, but I never forgot his face when I saw him again. I knew something terrible would happen. I followed him, waited until he was alone, and confronted him. I told him to leave. I tried to reason with him. He grabbed me hard, like he used to do to others. He sneered, called me a nosy old crow. I panicked. I pushed him back, stumbled. There was a stake for the roses. He fell on it. It went into his neck. I never meant to kill him. I stood there, too shocked to scream, too old to run. Then I saw the envelope in his hand. I recognized Judith Aldridge's name. I took it. I burned it net to protect her, to protect Millie. I waited until no one was around and slipped out. When the confession ended, there was silence. Inspector Hawthorne let out a slow breath. Manslaughter, he said. Accidentalities, by your account. Mrs. Hemmings didn't speak. You understand the gravity of this? I do. He turned to Miss Marple. And you believe her, Miss? Miss Marple looked steadily at him. I believe every word. There was a long pause. Then Inspector Hawthorne nodded and stood. I'll make the report to headquarters. The Crown Prosecution Service may or may not pursue formal charges depending on the evidence. But you'll need a solicitor. Mrs. Hemmings nodded. She rose slowly as she passed Miss Marple. Their eyes met. She did not thank her. She did not smile. But in her look, there was something else. Relief, the kind that comes when a secret is finally too heavy to carry alone. Miss Marple returned home just after midday. The village was quiet again, though. The air felt thinner somehow, like something unseen had been lifted. She poured herself small sherry, took her knitting from the basket, and sat near the window outside. Two boys chased a football down the lane. A woman swept her doorstep, a couplard, gently over what flowers to plant in life, as it always did, began to stitch itself back together. But Miss Marple knew this. The fabric was never the same. Once torn, once bloodied, it bore the imprint forever. Chapter 11. The Unraveling Thread. The drawing room of Rose Hill Vicarage was once again filled with people, but not for tea, not for hymns, and not for gossip. Not this time. Inspector Hawthorne, his notebook resting on the arm of Decare, Reverend Aldridge, silent and pale, Mrs. Judith Aldridge, eyes, rimmed red hands, folded tightly, Millie Tomlin seated near the fireplace, her face, unreadable, Charles Drackett recently rendered. From hiding eyes, downcast, and in the center of it all, in her usual lavender dress, with a delicate brooch, shaped like a thistle, sat Miss Jane Marple, her knitting untouched in her lap. She cleared her throat softly, and then she began. I always say, Miss Marple, start at that. People show you who they are if you know how to look. She glanced around, aberrant, listened. George Carraway came back to Rose Hill, not for money, not for formally, but for power. The power to stir up pain, the power to hurt people. He uncontrolled, and he chose his targets carefully. Her eyes moved to Charles Drackett. Mr. Dor Drackett was the first George knew. About his past knew he'd been in care. With him knew what secrets they shared. Mr. Drackett feared what might come out. He paid George to go. But George never planned to leave. Drackett looked down. He came here to find Millie. Miss Marple continued to reassert him. Twisted sense of ownership. But more than that, he came to destroy the people. Well, had rebuilt their lives. Without him, her gaze shifted to Judith Aldrich. He came for you, Judith, because you refused to speak. All those years ago, you were young, humiliated, and ashamed. But to a man like George, silence meant weakness. He returned, thinking you were still weak. Judith bowed her head, and when you found his body, you assumed someone else had finally done what you never dared to, and you burned his letter, not knowing who might be hurt by its contents. She turned now to Millie, and her tone softened. But it was always about you. Millie, he saw you as and finished, but you were not. You had grown. You had survived, and someone else, who loved you like a daughter, did what no one else had ever done, ship-housed, and then looked at Inspector Hawthorne. Mrs. Hemmings killed Georgia Carraway. Collective inhale. She didn't plan to, but in that final confrontation, she saw the fear in Millie's eyes all over again. An instinct took over, a single push, a folly, a fatal stake. Hawthorne nodded solemnly. She has confessed. The CPS may not prosecute, but her actions are now recorded. Reverend Aldrich leaned forward, pale. But how did you know? How could you be certain? Miss Marple gave Asmo a smile. It was the gardening stake, Arthur. Only someone who knew the orchard intimately would know where it was. And Mrs. Hemmings, she used to volunteer here on Sundays. Years ago, I remembered. She turned to Millie, one simmer. She tried to protect you, Millie, all these years. Quietly, completely, like Amathor wood. Tears had filled Millie's eyes now, but she didn't cry. She simply nodded dance. The room fell silent for a long moment, and then Miss Marple stood gently gathering. Her shawl, outside the sky, had cleared. Birds chirped softly in these edges. The roses, trimmed and blooming, once again swayed in the wind. Miss Marple walked the gravel path down to the gate. The storm had passed, but Sheck knew what others often forgot. In villages like Rose Hill, the real stories never screamed. They whispered, and Miss Marple. Elvis listened. Chapter 12. Life after the garden. 2 weeks had passed since the Gordon party that changed everything. Rose Hill was still the same Ian, the surface. The same winding lanes, the same lazy chimes from St. Agnes Church, and the same postman who always arrived 15 minutes late. But something had shifted. The whispers had dulled the tension, had loosened its grip, and the village was once again learning to breathe. At the Rose Hill tea room, the chatter had returned, not as frantic speculation, but as gentle curiosity. Who was baking the Victoria sponge this week? Would the council finally repaint the notice board? And had anyone seen Miss Marple? Miss Marple, in fact, was sitting in her usual corner at the tea room, her teacup half full, her gaze on the window where the morning sun danced across their glass. She had declined an invitation to speak in the radio. The Hampshire Broadcasting Service wanted her to share her method, and as though solving murder were like preserving jam, she preferred her piece. Across from her sat Millie Tomlin, wearing a modest yellow blouse and holding a cup of tea. She hadn't touched their sending Mrs. Hemmings to stay with her sister in Cornwall. Millie said softly. Miss Marple nodded, a wise decision away from gossip, and for memories. They won't charge her, will they? No, Inspector Hawthorne assured me. It will be handled discreetly. The law understands intent, Millie, and, more importantly, so do people when given time. Millie stared into Herdia. I feel strange, she admitted, like I should be angry or sad or something. Booty. Just feel like someone pulled a nail out of my chest that I didn't know. Weiss there, Miss Marple gave her a kind smile. That's called release, my dear. It can mess weirdly often after years of noise. Millie glanced at the window. Do y'all think the village will ever forget villages? Never forget, Miss Marple said gently, but they do move on. They bury pain in rows, beds in afternoon, tea, and eventually it fades, not because it wasn't real, but because life insists on continuing. There was a moment of quiet between them. Then Millie asked, and you, Miss Marple, what will you do now? Miss Marple sipped her tea. Oh, I imagine I'll finish that dreadful scarf I started knitting last winter, and there's a rather stubborn hydrangea pushed near my front gate that refuses to bloom. I'll tend to that, and I'll wait, yes. She smiled for the next time. Somio nun durestis, human nature. That afternoon in Primera Secretage, Charles Strackett sat at his desk once more. He had resumed writing. Not poetry now, but a confession of sorts. A short memoir about his childhood, about Guada, and about second chances. He didn't know if anyone would read. It bet it didn't matter, because writing it made him bready game at the vicarage. Judith Aldrich had taken up painting, something she hadn't touched in 20 years. She sat by the window, brush in hand, painting as more canvas of the orchard she had painted. Out the stake, painted only the shadows, painted only the roses, and somewhere in a small stone cottage at the edge of the village, Miss Marple sat by her fire, that evening knitting in her lap, in a letter, written on the desk she would not finish it tonight. Instead, she looked out the window where the wind moved softly through the garden. There were no screams, only silence, the kind that comes after truth and Shazmild, because that too. Whilst Justice, Chapter 13, the letter that wasn't burned. The village of Rose Hill had begun to bloom again, both literally and otherwise, but just as the air groused, till after a storm it sometimes carries one final gust, the kind that rattles a shutter that should have stayed closed 3 days after the vicarage drawing room had fallen silent. Miss Marple received a parcel. It was left on her doorstep with no note, no address, or only her name, written in an elegant, almost archaic hand inside a leather-bound book, a personal journal in between its pages, a letter that had not turned to ash in the fireplace. It was dated 2 days before George Carraway's death. The handwriting was uneven, rushed, desperate. Judith, you won't answer me, Booty. Need you to know something? I'm not here to hurt you. I came back because of me thing inside me is breaking. I've done terrible things, but you weren't every one of them. You mattered. You always did. They told me to forget you. We couldn't, not after what happened in that field. You remember it too, don't you? We were just children, but it was real, wasn't it? I need to explain. I don't want to die with this filth still on me. I'm leaving this with Charles. If you read Ethan, maybe, still a piece of me worth saving. Miss Marple read it twice. Then a third time she knew what it meant. George Carraway had not come back purely for revenge. He had come back to confess, perhaps. Not to the law, but Tor. But the tragedy of cruel people is this: even when they try to change, their past follows too close behind. She placed the letter back inside the journal, and slowly she picked up a sheet of parchment and began to write a new entry in her private file. Unresolved motives. Rose case. That afternoon, she took the journal to Charles Strackett, who opened the parcel with trembling hands. "I never read it," he said quietly. "He gave it to me the day before the garden party. Told me it was for later." I didn't care what he had to say, Miss Marple nodded. "Sometimes people wait too long to change, and sometimes it's not about forgiveness. It's about understanding." He stared at the letter a long while, then finally folded it. "Again, going to give this to Judith?" He said. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "She deserves to know that even monsters carry guilt, and that sometimes we are not the only one." Chanted later that week, a single envelope was placed in Mrs. Judith Aldrich's dressing table drawer. Ceremony, no discussion. She read it, and for a long time she cried, not because she had once loved the boy he had been, and now Sheknu, the man he became, had tried, even in failure, to say sorry that evening in her rose garden. Miss Marple dead-headed the last of death-faded blooms. She touched one gently, a pale pink hybrid tea, and whispered, "To I Tevin, roses bleed, don't they?" Then she returned indoors, and somewhere in that quiet, the ghost of George Caraway finally let go. Chapter 14, The Last Stitch. The fire in Miss Marple's sitting room crackled, softly casting long, gentle shadows across the carpet outside. The list of the autumn roses bowed their heads in the evening breeze, and a single leaf fluttered past the window, not with drama, but with the quiet dignity of something that knew its time had come. On her lap lay a half Venetia dish, soft blue wool threaded with silver. Her hands moved steadily, needles clicking faintly like a clock counting down its final hour. She wasn't in a hurry. After all, the hardest part of any mystery wasn't solving it, it was letting it end. Over the past days, the village of Rose Hill had begun to mend small, almost invisible appearance. Judith Aldrich returning to choir practice, Charles Drackett offering to tutor children at the parish school, and Millie Sweet Strong, Millie Smillingoggin, even if only once a day. No arrests, no trials, just truth laid cutely and precisely like bones uncovered after a long frost. The police report closed with the words, "Accidental death." No evidence of intent to kill. No psychological history of the deceased. Incredible witness testimony confirming unplanned physical. But Miss Marple had written a different report, the one she kept for herself. She kept it in her drawer beside letters from friends, long gone, and newspaper clippings no longer in print. It was titled, "The Garden." The Ghost in the Girl. As the clock chimed 7, Miss Marple set down her knitting and reached for her tea. Her fingers, though were steady, her mind, though gentle, was sharp. As ever, she had no desire for a Plazino interest in headlines. She did not solve crimes for fame. She did it because Simeon always noticed what others missed. The small things, the whisper names, the glove in the rose bed, the tear in the curtain, the lie wrapped in kindness, and most of all, the way people betray themselves with their eyes when one else is looking. She rose from her chair and walked to the window. The Vike was stretched before her. Dark roofs, dim lamps, smoke curling from chimneys. A sleepy, timeless place, but beneath every brick, every hedge, and every cup of tea there were stories, some beautiful, some terrible, all worth listening to. She drew the curtain closed, and then, like always, she went back to her knitting. One last stitch, tight, neat,